I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
This week on the show, I'm joined by Sagamore Institute Senior Fellow, Dr. Jerry Hendrix, retired Navy captain and one of the country's leading navalists. In this conversation, we analyze the country's national security challenges through the lens of the U.S. Navy, shipbuilding, and of course, the broader frame of the need to rebuild the arsenal of democracy to meet the challenges of the current decade.
I think we're going to have a really serious comeuppance at some point in time. I hate to say that because that comeuppance actually means dead Americans at some point in some future conflict, before we suddenly get our head around the fact that war has changed and we didn't. I think that China and Russia are anticipating that we're going to come out and try to fight a traditional battle, and they're already moving their forces and their operational plans to something different.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Jerry Hendrix, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
It's great to be back and to join this exciting conversation that you've been having, and I've really been enjoying since our last visit.
This is exciting because you are the first prominent guest we've had who actually listens to the show. So it means that we could really have a conversation that speaks to the themes we've been covering over the past year or so. So here's the first question then. The arsenal of democracy concept is fascinating to me because it brings in so many different parts of American society. We're talking about shipbuilding. Another second, we're talking about job training programs when it comes to reshoring manufacturing. You obviously are coming to this issue and you're writing from a naval perspective. I'm curious how your background as a retired Navy captain shaped how you think about these defense industrial base challenges, obviously the future of sea power, and our current geostrategic situation.
So it's interesting because I think in many ways, my story is a story of an ongoing education because you're right. I retired out of the Navy 10 years ago. And when I got out and started working in a think tank, my big focus was on naval force structure. We needed to have larger numbers. At first, it was a number. Then, of course, I realized that we need to go a little bit deeper in that. So it's like, what were the combinations under the numbers? So how many carriers, how many cruisers, how many destroyers? And then as I got into that, and I recognized that there was a challenge that no matter what we were doing, we weren't really able to see a significant bump in ship production. We were doubling the amount that we were spending on shipbuilding, but we weren't seeing any real advancement. And that's when, for instance, I remember reading Freedom's Forge for the first time, Arthur Herman's classic book. And I was really getting into, okay, wait a minute, it's the industrial base. And it's not just industrial base, but it's the size, the vastness of the industrial base, how much resiliency is in that industrial base. And so in many ways, over the last 5 years, a lot of my focus has been at getting at that industrial base, understanding industrial policy writ large, trying to figure out where the mechanisms are within the market or from the governance side. What type of laws do we need to be able to enable this? What type of support do we need? And that's one of the reasons why I've been listening so closely to you. I mean, you were one of the few people that had on a venture capitalist to have a conversation about where venture capital is and how that will play into the arsenal of democracy. And how it will cause that arsenal to evolve. Mm-hmm. Right now, we all talk about the importance of unmanned and AI, but who's making the investments in that? I'm not seeing it actually out of the Navy. The Navy seems hesitant to go big into AI, but I'm seeing venture capital jump in, sort of with both feet. And I look at like what Anduril as a company is doing right now with unmanned, and they are outpacing the United States government, Department of Defense. Australia is one of their primary supporters, and so they're looking for supporters who can think outside of the traditional box. And we here in the Department of Defense are very much locked into that box. So I see that, this has been almost like with Henry Adams' favorite book, the education of Jerry Hendrix has been ongoing for the last 10 years. And your podcast is just one of the places where I come to be educated.
Perfectly stated. We'll put that in the pitch deck for sponsors. The way that I'd articulate this then, I'm in town for the Hill in the Valley. So it's a big tech government military summit that's going on the Hill right now as we record. And I was speaking to the CEO of an AI company that will go unnamed, but people have probably heard of him. And he just asked me point blank, okay, you focus on the defense industrial base. How much is AI just going to be this unlock that solves this issue? And my answer to him is basically no. I'd be curious, just reflexively no. If you're looking at what Russia's able to do right now, if you're looking at what China's able to do right now, they're doing all of that, outpacing us when it comes to munitions, when it comes to shipbuilding, without game-changing AI unlocks. So that suggests there's actually some complicated factors, a little different purely from the question of like, what's our tech stack look like? How would you think about that question of how much can the space you've been spending 10 years on be solved by some developers in Silicon Valley coming up with a new tech approach?
So the challenge as I see it, and I'll tell you a quick story. There was a large bureaucracy within the Navy about 20 years ago that was just not working. I won't get into names of particulars, but a particular admiral at that time had an innovative idea that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that command and I'm going to move it to an entirely different state, different city, different locale. But I'm not going to move any of the people. I'm going to build a new building someplace in the middle of the country, and I'm going to stand up an entire new staff, and I'm not going to allow any of the old staff to move over there. Honestly, at this point in time, one of the themes that I've come up with is, I think the United States Navy has been preparing to fight the Battle of Midway over again for the past 70 years. Ever since we did it the first time in June of 42, we've been prepared to have a major carrier battle in the middle of the Pacific Ocean somehow. Well, that's not coming. If there's anything that Ukraine is showing us, whether it's the Black Sea or the operations ashore, is that the next battle is not going to look like the next battle. And so counter to what Secretary of Defense Bob Gates once said, when he complained about next war-itis, we really need to catch next war-itis in a huge way and really step out of the box and reimagine this. But right now, I don't think that the Department of Defense is up to that because they're looking for stability. And for that matter, the relationship between the Department of Defense and the traditional primes is set up in such a way that they're all looking for stability. The DoD wants to get ships and aircraft on time, on budget. The primes want to meet their earnings. They're going to want to declare their dividends. They want their 8% profit margin. They want to make sure that they get solid executive bonus plans so they can retain the top talent in MBAs in this country. Those two things are really at odds with what the future of the military and competition looks like. And when someone talks about that, well, that's almost heretical, which I'm comfortable with, being a heretic in the Church of the Navy. The point here is I think that you're going to look at people like high-tech companies. I mentioned Anduril, so I'll use that again so we won't unduly benefit or hurt anybody else. But the fact is what Palmer Luckey has done there and what Chris Brose has done. By the way, they're not a client of mine. I don't work with them. But I'm really impressed because they're leaping ahead. And they're leaping ahead not necessarily at the direction of the Department of Defense. I think we're going to have a really serious comeuppance at some point in time. I hate to say that because that comeuppance actually means dead Americans at some point in some future conflict before we suddenly get our head around the fact that war has changed and we didn't. I think that China and Russia are anticipating that we're going to come out and try to fight a traditional battle, and they're already moving their forces and their operational plans to something different.
I think what's fascinating here, so two things, one at a time. So I want to really focus in, especially for the civilian audience, on the importance of your point around the Navy being overly fixated on the Midway story, because that reminds me of my Arsenal of Democracy reading. When you're learning about the Japanese Navy during World War II, you really realize that they were overly obsessed with the Battle of Tsushima during the Russo-Japanese War as just like, it's the mythology, it's the mythos, it's the Japanese Navy's understanding of itself, it's the focus on battleships, et cetera. How does the focus on this truly conflict and era-defining experience, the Battle of Midway, holding back how the Navy approaches these challenges?
Well, it's become cultural. So, Battle of Midway involved virtually every aspect of the Navy. There's, surface action. There's even a submarine action within it. Obviously, the aviation action is now legendary. And so that in a very big way, it's one of the largest and most historical naval battles in the history of mankind. So, of course, we're proud of it. And of course, we built fort structure around it. starting in 1951, we have been building a United States Navy based around the concept of operations that was proven at the Battle of Midway. We moved away from battleships after Pearl Harbor. We moved towards carrier-based operations, and it is not just a method of operation. It is culture. And culture runs deep within the United States Navy, perhaps deeper than any of the other services. It has a near religious capturing of the mind. And so understanding that, perhaps the real means of going forward is submarines and missiles, that the Pacific Ocean would become some vast no man's land where submarines would roam, specifically nuclear-powered submarines equipped with long-range cruise missiles or ballistic missiles, that would be the predominant factor to bring about a blockade of another nation or the sinking of its shipping, but sending out large aircraft carriers. I always tell this anecdotal story. I had a chance to speak with several astronauts who had flown in the space shuttle or, for that matter, gone up to the International Space Station. And one of the most routine things that I heard from Navy astronauts, pilots and commanders of the space shuttle, is their ability to look down from space using some low-level optics and spot the carriers that they used to fly off from. They could actually go down and look at the numbers. Hey, there's number 71, there's the Theodore Roosevelt, there's the Abraham Lincoln, there's the George Washington, et cetera. Okay, so if astronauts from space with the low level of optics can go ahead and spot these carriers, exactly how covert are they? I know about weather, and yes, I know the Pacific's a vast ocean that I could hide the moon in, but the fact of the matter is this is still observable. And the Chinese have been working ever since Desert Storm in 1991 to come up with both a sensor system as well as a long-range standoff weapon system to be able to counter that platform. So have we moved ahead? No, we haven't. One of my great fears is that the age of the carrier passed some decades ago, and we didn't notice. And so, how do we adjust? At this point in time, I clearly want to keep building submarines. I want to build them in larger numbers. I'd like to keep building destroyers because destroyers have naval presence missions that are very important to us to try to maintain the peace. But I have real serious concerns, specifically largely because the Navy has failed to adapt the air wing, giving it longer range, more lethality from distance. Because the Navy hasn't adapted its air wing, I fear the declining relevance of the carrier, and yet our carriers are costing more and more. Gerald R. Ford came in at just shy of $15 billion. That used to be the entire Navy shipbuilding budget for a year in my lifetime. And now that's the cost of one ship. And if there's
not exactly on time either.
Yeah. And if there's one lesson in war, never build a platform that you can't afford to lose. And I do fear that carriers have achieved that status, the weapon that you can't afford to lose. It's a big mistake strategically.
So here's what's interesting here. I want to go back to your comment about fearing comeuppance. So obviously, if you're looking at World War II, comeuppance is in the form of Pearl Harbor, Battle of Kasserine Pass, the Philippines. But in a weird way, those were more tactical and strategic than structural. Imagine a Pearl Harbor where we hadn't, lined all of the ships perfectly up, or the planes weren't perfectly set in order to be bombed. That wasn't a structural reality of the U.S. Army at the time, or of a Navy's position in the Pacific. So I guess the question for you is, if we look at the 1938 to 1940 period, the pre-war period, I think something politically that the FDR administration does successfully is start to make some of the big structural changes that are going to pay off. Everything from using the Civilian Conservation Corps as basically a pre-training for the Army, doing the massive war games across like the South. What could we be doing right now that we're not doing that's a little separate from kind of like the tactical choices that could lead to mistakes in the short term?
So I like the way that you frame that, but let me roll it back just a little bit further, because you used the 1938 Two Ocean Navy Act bill, I think, which is something we all should look at. I mean, the aircraft carriers that began to hit the fleet in 1943 are ordered in 38, 39, and 40. There's always long lead on these. It takes 5 years at a minimum to build a super carrier, sometimes longer. So if you want that carrier, if you think you're going to be at war with a major power, which I think there's a higher than equal probability that we will in the near term, then the only thing you're going to bring the fight is the stuff that we're already building because of the timeline and the time lag that goes with that. But I think that when you talk about the interwar period, you got to roll back a little bit further, because you mentioned war games. Well, there's war games and then there was war exercises. So we war gamed all of the plans, Plan Black, Plan Orange, Plan Red. We war gamed all of those on the tables at Newport, at the Naval War College in Newport. And we came up with different ideas. Well, then the fleet turned around and we began a series of 19 fleet exercises. Every year, almost twice a year, we would get the fleet together and go out and we would practice something. We bombed the locks at Panama. We practiced bombing Pearl Harbor years before the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. And we began to understand the role of fleet submarines and fleet carriers. Originally, carriers were only going to be scouting force for the battleships, but it was these exercises that highlight the fact that no, the carrier can become a strike asset. The carrier can become the centerpiece asset for the fleet. And so, today, are we doing those? Well, I can tell you that we do war games every year. The Navy does a big war game. We do a big fleet exercise, but all those fleet exercises and many of those fleet games are choreographed in such a way as to justify the current program of record. No one wants to actually go out and lose a war game that might disprove a major portion of your budget. So again, with the service becoming increasingly culturally conservative about its current force structure and wanting to promote that force structure, that's one of the things that I really celebrated about the fact of now former Representative Mike Gallagher, is that Gallagher got involved in wargaming and had significant questions about the validity of the war games that we were doing. And he wanted to start the Congress running war games of their own so they could get an unvarnished, unrefereed, uncolored look at exactly how well are we doing. I mean, you may remember that there was a big war game in the 1990s that Lieutenant General von Ripper of the Marine Corps went out and he sank a bunch of carriers on day one, and the services just went nuts. The Navy went absolutely nuts. And he did this with small swarming craft, loaded up, small whaleboats loaded up with weapons that came out and swarmed the carrier, hit it like we did with the USS Cole. That happened to that. And so von Riper actually looked at this, and the Navy then the next day refloated everything and then told him to go away in color, because that was not the answer that they wanted out of that. So I think that you really need, to come back to the heretic idea, we're going to need more heretics, more real significant red teaming that's going to look and say, will that carrier even get there? We talk about Taiwan all the time. I don't know how we resupply Taiwan. I'm a retired Navy captain with a PhD in war studies, and I can't tell you how I'm going to get in and resupply Taiwan. Now, there may be some secret, black project out there that I'm not aware of, and I'm willing to say that. But the fact is I look at this all the time, and I'm not sure. So to me, that's a big challenge.
You're also articulating, though, why the myth or the image of the Battle of Midway is so attractive, because, well, if there's a big cataclysmic battle that we then win, the question of resupply is less significant. So it's easy to imagine, not easy, but it's, I think, analytically convenient to imagine this as being a short, swift conflict versus 6 months, 8 months, a year, that dynamic.
I don't see us fighting beyond 6 months. I once participated in a game, unclassified game, that was all about the industrial base. And, effectively we ran out of bullets. Now, that was a decade ago, so there could be some significant changes in supplies and everything. But the problem that I see is we all think that somehow it's going to be Desert Storm, 100-Hour War, or the road to Baghdad that we did in 2003, or for that matter, even setting up and going out and plinking, people on mules in Afghanistan. It's not going to be that way. China is a major industrial power. Even right now with Russia, Russia has shown amazing resiliency after their initial failures because of material condition of their army and the poor training. They've, someone recently said that Russia has reconstituted its forces and is back in larger numbers. But it's back in larger numbers in many ways because we allowed the pressure. But the fact is both of these are large economies who have the ability to regenerate. We right now, because we have offshored so much of our industrial base, have an inability to regenerate. That's one of the reasons I've been talking about a SHIPS Act to be on par.
Like the CHIPS Act.
Like the CHIPS Act, on par with the CHIPS Act, where we were going to plunge, tens of billions of dollars into refurbishing and modernizing our shipbuilding industrial base. And by the way, not just Navy industrial base, but commercial shipbuilding industrial base. It makes no sense that China would have a 200-to-1 ratio in their production capacity on shipbuilding, given the fact that we're about to become a major export economy again. Liquefied natural gas, other manufacturing goods. Should not some of those goods be traveling on U.S. hulls that we actually gain income going and coming from those foreign ports and markets? I think we should be getting back into that. And although I know that runs in opposition to a lot of free market libertarian type viewpoints on global economy, the fact is there's a national security element to the industrial base and to the economy that we need to pay attention to.
I'm glad you set it up that way, though, because we're at this interesting moment where, A, the TikTok bill's passage reflects the fact, in a way that would not have been passed several years ago, that at a bipartisan level, the national security imperative of this moment has started to overwhelm, let's say, status quo pre-2020 thoughts on this issue. I guess the way that I would put this is legitimately becoming a bipartisan issue on both sides of the aisle, at least from an articulated perspective. So for this last section, I'd love for you to get your understanding of where is the gap between everyone nodding their head when you say what you said. There's a bunch of people in the Navy who've probably made mad, but I would say at a broad generalist perspective, that makes a lot of sense. People nod to that. Why has that not translated into a CHIPS Act? Why am I seeing some version of the op-ed about the commercial industrial base that could have been published a year ago get published now because the problem hasn't been addressed?
Well, first of all, I think the commercial sector, commercial shipbuilding in this country has so atrophied that there's virtually very little lobbying or, for that matter, political support for it in the country. So when I was recently talking with someone and about a CHIPS Act, and they said, well, you should take that language. You should take this idea and you should go down and talk to Congressman X, and he should be your champion. And I said, no, I don't want to go to Congressman X because he has a Navy base and a Navy shipyard, a Navy commercial shipyard, one of the big major primes that build ships for the Navy, and he will want to salt in support for the Navy yard and that Navy shipbuilder, when in fact, I think the most emphasis we need to have, if you want to know why there's not enough shipyard workers to build Navy ships, it's because there's no commercial shipyard workers that can flow back and forth depending on the economic situation or the national security crisis. The biggest area of investment we need right now is in commercial shipbuilding. And then it will have downstream effects for the Navy, helping to lower the cost of spare parts and components, as well as giving us a larger supplier base, as well as giving us a larger workforce that's better trained. And so to me, I want to if I'm looking for the champion of champions on a CHIPS Act, I'm looking for a congressman that's sitting in the middle of the country who doesn't have a Navy base and doesn't have a shipbuilder, but understands the importance of commerce and transportation and will make the investments in a CHIPS Act on par from a commerce and transportation viewpoint. And so we build up that commercial side, and then the Navy benefits as an ancillary effect. Right now, if you look at the Chinese, and I talked about these 19 yards they have in a 200-to-1 ratio, the fact is the Chinese Navy, which is growing faster than any other Navy in the world and has already surpassed us in terms of hulls, is a byproduct of its commercial shipbuilding. In our country, the Navy is the product, and we sometimes make a couple commercial ships. So, we've got to reverse that ratio, get back on par. By the way, back on par with the ratio that Alfred Thayer Mahan described 100 years ago, 130 years ago, when he started to write about the influence of sea power upon history. It is the commercial fleet from which a nation derives both money and power. We do not have a commercial fleet, so we have seen a decline in money and a decline in our power.
So to understand this, though, something you pointed out at the start of this podcast is that when you were starting out in this space, your focus was primarily on the numbers, like getting to the 600-ship Navy, that in many ways references the kind of Reaganite response during the Cold War in the 1980s. However, you said during that anecdote that you started to realize that this wasn't purely about if we spend X billions of dollars, we will get X numbers of ships. So how do we goal set then? Because to your point, if you're looking for some member of Congress who's like in the Midwest and like no direct basis to this, their understanding of this from a goals perspective, from a mission perspective, is going to be numbers focused. And I think focusing on sheer amounts of spending would make it more tangible, but it doesn't quite work like that. So how should we goal set? How should we assess our targets for what we're actually trying to accomplish in this space?
So I think the key thing here, so if I look for the golden goose, if I want more ships, what do I really need? It's not just more money. It's actually more graving docks. It's more shipyards. Right now, you have 7 primary shipyards that build the United States Navy spread out across the country. I need about 15. We have about 15 graving docks where you lay down ship keels and you start building these things up and then you put them in the water. We actually need closer to 50. And so I want to expand the population of shipyards, and then I want to access the graving docks and modernize those graving docks so I can build more ships more quickly and more efficiently. And I want to build up that workforce that goes with it. So a Ships Act should look at, if I'm going to go and build a new type of ship, let's just say that we're finally going to start building a medium unmanned surface vessel, something we've all been talking about. And we say that the fleet needs, but there's not one being constructed in large scale. If I was to ask one of the current prime shipbuilders to build that for me, I've wasted an opportunity. Whereas if I take that contract and I direct it at one of these smaller, medium shipyards, whether it's on the Gulf Coast or even for that matter, thinking out of the box, up the Mississippi River, or even as far as the Ohio, or up on the Great Lakes where we're building a frigate right now. And if I access one of those shipyards where perhaps they already have workforce, they have blue collars in abundance, because we're seeing on the East Coast and West Coast that blue collar workers are not in abundance, they're a scarcity. But I move the work to where I have workforce and I have shipyards and some graving docks already established, building something else, whether it's river traffic or Great Lakes traffic, and I leverage that, well, then that actually begins expanding that industrial base. And to me, that's all about, you and I talked in our last conversation about the Last Supper. And when Deputy Secretary of Defense Bill Perry convened everybody together, and we went from 105 primes down to about 5.
Back at the end of the Cold War.
End of the Cold War. We need to figure out the first breakfast, which is how do I not deflate the industrial base, but how do I re-expand that industrial base? Where do I put the pipe stem in and start blowing this thing back up again? Well, to me, you got to get away from the tried and the true and the relationship that the primes have with the Department of Defense, which is very comfortable, very stable. And we're going to have to go find competitors and then create that competition and put robustness and resilience back into the marketplace.
So 2 last questions here. So when we had Arthur Herman, Hudson colleague, on the show, he talked about this concept he's working on called the arsenal of democracies, looking at your point about the atrophying of the defense industrial base, saying, look, it's not World War II, therefore Japan, Korea, Australia, European allies, et cetera. What do you think about our capacity to make up for our outsourced, weakened economy with our allies?
All right. So this is really good, and we may run a little long.
Yeah. This is your time.
This is a really exciting topic. And I would have told you if you'd asked me this question 2 years ago that there's absolutely no chance whatsoever that this happens, that we would make access of foreign shipbuilders or foreign industrial capacity, because we have a Buy American Act here in the United States, and that has been rock solid in support for that. However, as you said, there's a growing national consensus in the middle of this country, left, right, center, about the proximate threat that we are facing. And so we all now recognize we need ships now. And no matter how much money we spend with the major primes we have here, we are not seeing an increase in capacity. So, we have foreign shipbuilders that are coming here, and they're saying, hey, let us build those, in our yards back in Korea, Japan, or in Europe. A number of different shipyards in Europe could do that as well. And our answers thus far has been no. because what we want them to do is come here, buy a small shipyard, invest in that, spend their money here, hire American workers, and build ships here. Well, that still doesn't answer the question of getting me ships now.
It's a peacetime approach.
That's right. It's a peacetime approach. So I think that there's a bridge to be built, and let me just sketch this out.
Yeah, please.
Okay, which is to say, let's say I want to recapitalize the military Sea Lift Command fleet, 44 ships, largely based upon commercial variants. All right. So, and let's just say one of those foreign shipyards wants to do that. Well, let me take the first 3 years of that and say, okay, I want you to come here. I want you to buy a U.S. shipyard. I want you to start making investments in modernizing that shipyard and hiring workforce and training. During that first 3 years, I'm going to allow you to build 2 ships a year in your yard in your home country. Mm-hmm. Okay. In the second 3 years, and this is a 10-year block buy type deal. We're doing a lot of those. In the second 3 years, we're going to go 1 and 1. You're going to build 1 in your home country, 1 here in the United States in the yard that you've bought and modernized. And then over the last 4 years, you got to build everything here. That allows me to access their marketplace, their workforce, and what they already have in the immediate term. Mm-hmm. They get profit, return on investment that they've already made in those home yards. They probably are able to produce those ships fairly cheaply if you're thinking about Mitsubishi, Hyundai, or Fincantieri in their home Italy yards. And we are able to get those ships here now. But in the long run, by the time we get to the end of the decade, we have 3 major manufacturers who have invested in yards here, modernized them, and brought new competition, resilience, and redundancy here to the American industrial base.
It's good to hear an actual plan. So here's the final point then. The crescendos, if you're pointing out that there's clearly a not superficial, but there's a light consensus by DC standards around the potential crisis we're facing. What is your advice from as someone who just thinks about this and speaks to different audience about this? What have you learned from speaking to, let's say, the Atlantic, right, kind of like center-left, curious audience about communicating this in a way that leads to actually moving beyond from like consensus to actual plan and implementation? So
there's a lot of vagueness there. I mean, they appreciate the fact that the conversation is brought to them. They act surprised a lot of the time. They're somewhat concerned with my sense of urgency, the need that we need this now, because they don't. But they appreciate the fact that it's been brought to them. You and I have talked in the past offline about the importance of trying to access other audiences. So I wrote for the Atlantic because I wanted to touch the Atlantic. I submit a lot of op-eds to the New York Times, most of which are rejected because I'm trying to reach that audience, the audience that I don't see as being engaged in this national security, national defense economic conversation. We need to continue that. Specifically, I think of myself as a center-right Eisenhower Republican, which I'm a fairly old-fashioned centrist on a lot of things. We need to rebuild that vital center, but that also means that the right has to talk to the left and the left needs to talk to the right. I need a few more Scoop Jacksons and in this country at this point in time. And I'm eager to find those and talk with them. That's why with the SHIPS Act, when I go out and talk with people, I always try to talk with Republicans and Democrats. If I find a Republican sponsor, you can bet I'm going to find a Democrat co-sponsor to go forward with that. And I've talked with a few of them up there, Navy veterans who are now serving in the House, leading Democrat senators who are interested in this from a commercial transportation standpoint. We need to kind of really do that. I don't like the idea that the only thing that matters is maintaining my majority. If you're only governing to continue to govern and not to accomplish anything, you will lose your right to govern. So, let's get at the solutions-based versus the issues-based conversation.
And if we're trying to rebuild a vital center, this is the perfect place to do it because, once again, the threat and the danger is so clear if you're paying attention to it. Jerry, this has been really great. Thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
It's, again, great pleasure to be here and always an awesome conversation.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.